week or two a bit of a shortfall in terms of personalities, but that's just, you know, I was about to say, a good thing in the end, perhaps. Marilyn Young couldn't be here because of an urgent family matter that required her going out of town. And then we had an illness. It's actually not even on the program. We've got a Welsh, it's actually, Constantina Monaco from Yale, couldn't come here because of a very bad case of the influenza. So we're only 3 people. This morning I was determined that I was just going to introduce the speakers and get on with it. But I then had a sensation that something was not quite right. And so I figured that I would introduce the panel by saying a couple of things about my experience, reflections on what is essentially the 4th day of conferencing about the Mediterranean and the Cold War. There was a conference 2 years ago, was it? Yeah, about the same topic, during which we essentially spent 2 days discussing what is the Cold War and what is the Mediterranean. And yesterday, only determining the proceedings was the same very concern, and I'm not entirely persuaded that we're not going to spend today discussing that question as well. Is the Cold War a meaningful category? In what sense is it meaningful? For the purposes of understanding something called the Mediterranean, is there such a thing as the Mediterranean? In what sense is it a region? Etc., etc. So I think from my perspective, is there something you're trying to get in? It may be that that door actually closes. These are essential questions, and I have my own take on this, and I think I'd say, because it actually fits with the 2 talks that we're going to hear this morning, a little bit about my own perspective on this, or reflections on this. First, the issue of region. A region is at once bigger and smaller than a nation state. In this case, bigger. Is the Mediterranean, and to what extent is the Mediterranean a region? That is to say, something that can appear, if you want to put it in vague Jacobian terms, as an object of policy. What does it take for the Mediterranean as a region, if it is a region, to appear in a geopolitical context or in a policy context called the Cold War? Neither of those 2 terms is, again, a given. Obviously, the Mediterranean is a physical entity of sorts. And even though regions anywhere are by definition, to coin a phrase, constructed, they're not preternaturally given. In the case of the Mediterranean, it is very much tilting towards the preternaturally given. That is to say, it's a physical space. It's, in fact, very interesting from that angle, an inland sea. It's one of the few inland seas that exist in the world. And so the regional aspect of the Mediterranean is intrinsically given, I think, or tendentially given, conducively given, by the fact that it's an inland sea. For 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, it is essentially a very good way of navigating. At least in the summertime, it's one of the few naval spaces or waterways that you can actually navigate. And so the fact of transportation makes this into a quote-unquote natural region. For a couple of millennia, it's one of the best places to set up a communication system. It's cheaper to transport grain from Spain to Lebanon in antiquity than it is to transport grain 10, 15, 20 miles inland. And I'm not talking about the mountains of Lebanon. So, it is a good space for communication, and thereby tendentially a region in that sense. Of course, it achieves in Greco-Roman times 2 different versions of integration. In the Roman times, it becomes territorially integrated into land. region that can be compared actually to another inland sea source, namely the Baltic, and the way in which the Baltic becomes a region, and also the way in which the Baltic ceases to be a region, depending on geopolitics. The Baltics is an inland sea, an economic region in the Hansa period, and it is territorially integrated in a period of Swedish dominance, the 17th century, when it becomes essentially a Swedish lake.
I knew you'd bring up Swedish dominance.
No, I know that. I had the opportunity. I couldn't resist. This is a really odd argument here, so I've been reminded
I
of this.
appreciate it, quite because
It ceases to be a region in 1721 when Peter actually ejects the Swedes, and so the eastern seaboard of the Baltic ceases to be an integrated part of the whole from the viewpoint of the Swedes. And from then, it's not been really a region in a strong sense until recent years, when the Swedes again trying in a kind of neo-colonial way to reinvent its own project, but I'll leave that aside. In the Mediterranean case, it ceases to be an integrated region, of course, because of Islam, and because of the internal destruction of the Roman Empire. And so it's cut left to right, or west to east, or east to west, in the middle for a good number of years, for geopolitical reasons. So it ceases to be a region despite its natural contact system, objective or physical contact system. It is then reconnected, which we talked about endlessly in this conference and the preceding conference, through colonialism. Right? In the 19th and 20th century, climaxing in the 20th century, a north-south axis, Western European dominance, expansion, control over the southern tier, from North Africa all the way over to the remnants of the Ottoman Empire in the east. So it again becomes a region of sorts, but on totally different kind of basis than in the Greco-Roman epoch. So geopolitics of sorts, or a kind of economic and geopolitical move or process, has kind of destroyed the region first, and then reconnected it in other terms. That then raises the issue of decolonization in the early period of the Cold War, which I'll come back to. Regions come and go. I mean, for example, Central Europe. Remember Central Europe? Central Europe was a German idea in the early 20th century. It was a great Großraum for the Germans to expand economically and politically. That comes to an end. It comes to an end very forcefully through World War II and through the ensuing divisions of the Cold War. But the Mediterranean has a much stronger geographical unity attached to it as a waterway. I mean, this whole thing then becomes different, actually, physically, once railroads were introduced in the 1840s and transportation qualitatively shifts. I mean, people tend to forget that, Napoleon couldn't move his army any quicker than the Romans could. But once you get railroads and once you get steam and the transportation revolution of the 19th century, then the geography, as it were, shifts, and the physicality becomes a different kind of issue. But the Mediterranean, nevertheless, remains a strategic space as a naval space, and as an integral function, not only in a colonial sense of North and South, but also because of the British system. You recall that Vicky spoke yesterday about Reitzel, an American who writes in 1948 about the possibility of turning the Mediterranean into an object of US policy after the Truman Doctrine. What he says is the Mediterranean is a dubious unity. However, it does have a system attached to it in geopolitical terms. He doesn't use that word, but that's what it means. And that is the British system. The British system is now only a form without content. and has no resources. Therefore, we have resources. We have to fill the British system, which is a naval system, which is an imperial system, and it emphasizes the Eastern Mediterranean, but it actually involves then certain strong points: Gibraltar, Malta, the Suez Canal, Cyprus, Eastern Mediterranean, and so forth and so on, Turkey and Greece. And so his kind of reinvented regional policy is giving the British system American muscle, succeeding John Bull, pure and simple. So there is, in that sense, a regional geopolitical or geostrategic naval aspect to this. If you scrape the surface of that idea, you'll find Mahan. You'll find the late 19th century, early 20th century reflection on the importance of navies for the purpose of becoming a great power. And the example of England, which is what Mahan theorizes, the most well-disseminated thinker of the late 19th centuries, is the American Admiral Mahan, who theorizes on the basis of an historical history the brilliant example of the English, and deduces from that the notion that the United States, being an island, as he likes to imagine it, like England, should turn the Caribbean into the equivalent of the Mediterranean. There's a lot of talk in the late 19th century and early 20th century about the Mediterranean as an example of a space constitutive of great power in the naval sense, and that all great power ultimately is about the English example. And McKinnon then revises this and says the Eurasian hinterland, but we'll leave that aside. And so the naval aspect of the Mediterranean is more or less constant throughout. There is always a way in which you can think about the Mediterranean from a naval standpoint. And there is a relatively autonomous US and British traditional thought about the Mediterranean as a naval space, which has its own logic, depending on the technology and so forth. As I said, the north-south colonial aspect of this intersects with that naval aspect, but it isn't the same. And so the issue of colonization and decolonization enters into the picture. And much of this conference and the preceding conference has been about how does the phenomenon of colonialism and the auxiliary decolonization intersect with the problematic of the Cold War. And there's been no single answer to that issue. Here I'm reminded of Senator John F. Kennedy, who in the 1950s, in a notorious and unorthodox move occasioned by the ongoing struggle over Algeria, says explicitly that the Cold War and decolonization are two discrete processes. They are not the same. And the United States, it's incumbent upon the United States as a world power that stands for universal values to have a policy and a standpoint on decolonization, which is independent of the standpoint that the US has on the Cold War. Since the two processes are discrete and autonomous, what goes on in decolonization should not be interpreted or decided upon on the premise that it has something to do intrinsically with the Cold War. For this, he was given a lot of flack by the New York Times and others, not only for the immediate political issue of Algeria and the problems that that speech or those arguments was said to have, destructive effect that it was said to have on the negotiations going on between France and Algeria, or regarding Algeria, but also because it was really a break with the orthodoxy of the Cold War. I have to say then that Senator John F. Kennedy, when he became President Kennedy, discovered that this was not so. Much as I admire that standpoint and the courage he took to express it for somebody who was eyeing to become, you know, the next President of the United States, even when he was saying this in 1958, it is nevertheless quite incorrect to say that these two things are, from the American standpoint, discrete processes. They're not discrete processes from that standpoint at all. For the very simple reason that anything the United States does in the 1950s by way of geopolitics or acting in the world is ultimately overdetermined in the last instance, and the last instance arrived again and again and again by the Cold War as a US project. So I would insist that there is no way ultimately of reading anything outside that framework. In short, it's not as though everything that happens is a product of that, but it is to say that there is no way ultimately that you can stand up and defend to the teeth that these things are independent of one another. Nothing is independent if you want to look at what the United States does and doesn't do in the world from the ultimately determining position on the Cold War. There is nothing outside the Cold War from that standpoint, which isn't to say that they always act in unison with that, but it is to say that it is overdetermined, cuts across every single aspect of what the United States does and doesn't do. And so from that standpoint, I think JFK is really wrong. That's why I also think that Oddon is quite wrong. The Cold War is not, he's not here, but nevertheless he should be here, right? Yeah, so I can say this anyway. The Cold War is not a clash of modernizations or an equal, you know, universalizing modernization on one side, clashing with an equal universalizing modernization on the other side. This is quite wrong. It's to reread or re-inject the 1970s on the 1940s and forget about the moment of emergence of the Cold War, which is an American one. And I insist on this. It's an American project. It's defined in American terms. They're not even Churchill's terms. Slightly Bevin's, but not quite. And they're certainly not Stalin's. The terms of the Cold War, the way the Cold War is constituted, formulated, discursively framed, you name it, are US terms, in no uncertain terms. And one has to recognize that historically. The idea of clashing modernization is historically false. It's historically false, empirically wrong. Which is not to say that there isn't a clash of modernization down the line once the game is off to the races, right? Or once we actually have a structure, or once we actually have a system. But that's different from the constitution of the form. And the constitution of the form in this case is a matter of recognition. It's a matter of diplomacy and recognition and the takeover of the World War II format. I'm not going to bore you with the actual details of that, but the Cold War, to put it in the simplest possible way, is the answer to the question, in Collingwoodian terms, the unique question. In what possible form is it possible, is it doable to put the United States into the world on a global scale, politically, economically, but above all strategically, in peacetime, against every single tradition from its inception in 1787-89, and make that proposition unanswerable in 1946, 47, 48? And the answer is a recast version of the Hitler argument of the World War II framework. And that's the end, the long and the short of it. After that, it's an unanswerable proposition. The United States has to be global. The United States has to stop the Russians. The United States has to act and do what it takes. And then you have a space of strategic reasoning which has to do with doing X rather than Y and squabbling over what that means in concrete terms. And that's where the Mediterranean then enters into the proceedings in the 1950s. It becomes, you know, a place which is multifaceted as a strategic investment from that standpoint. That has contingent, specific issues arising out of that framework. But as Mark Mazzauer said yesterday, it is in fact concretely, if you look at the contingent events of what happens in the Mediterranean in the 50s onward, largely a US project. Largely a US project. Now, I woke up in this morning and I felt I had to say that. It's a pity that my Norwegian compatriot isn't here. Let me introduce our speakers for this morning. On my immediate left, Jim Miller, who helped me out in the early 80s when I was lost and not found in Washington, D.C., and trying to get to the archives and figure out what I was doing. And he was more knowledgeable about archives and the ins and outs of how to do things in Washington than anybody else I came across. He's now at Georgetown in what used to be at the State Department, handling the foreign relations series and struggling, I think, with some success against, I was about to say the evil empire, but that's not what I mean. Yeah, okay. To get things published rather than censored. He was a specialist at that time, I thought, and I think he would agree probably, on Italy, and he's been a specialist, one of the most knowledgeable people, I think, in officialdom about Italy ever since. But he's expanded that and become an expert on the whole Mediterranean, or the northern side of it, if you want to put it that way, from Spain to Greece. And particularly, aside from all the stuff that he's written about Italy, he's written a widely acclaimed recent book called The United States in the Making of Modern Greece, History and Power, 1950 to 1974. Jim?
Thank you. That's it?
Yeah?
Great.
You think that's all right?
It's fine by me.
Okay.
As you see, this goes back a long way. Okay, Anders has done a nice job of covering the first 10 or 12, 15 pages of my paper. This was pretty
So you're going to respond to this?
Yeah, well, I will in my own, in a moderate way. But this was all pre-cooked anyway, and I think he had a good point that somebody ought to put it on the table and then shut up about it. So I'm going to sort of summarize my own conclusions in the first 15 or 20 pages of this paper, something like this. The first question I asked was, is the Mediterranean the type of unity that could create a single policy? And this is my firm State Department background, but I come down as a firm maybe. Did the U.S. have a Mediterranean strategy? And my answer to that is no. But allowing for that and honoring fact, giving it precedence over theory, can we construct a set of hooks, as I call them, on which to base some kind of credible analysis of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War period in the Mediterranean? And I think the answer there is probably. So what I'm going to do very briefly is outline some of these hooks that I see, and you'll see that there are some differences between myself and my distinguished friend over here on this matter. And the first of these hooks is, in fact, modernization. But I would understand modernization as the desire or the realization by elites in the area that they had to change or else. And for the independent states of the Mediterranean region, Spain, Portugal, Italy, latterly, Greece, this is a process which really begins at the end of the 18th century and carries on into the 19th century. The search for modernization as a means of maintaining an independent status closely connected with the idea of nationalism. For the colonial dependencies, the 20th century obviously is the point at which having, or being in the process of exiting from foreign domination, the question of modernization becomes an absolutely critical one. In other words, how do we maintain ourselves as an independent entity in the world? Somewhere situated happily in the middle of all this, of course, is Egypt, which in fact had a first run at modernization in the early 19th century, roughly up to 1870 or 1884, and then found itself once again reduced to colonial status under the British Empire, which is, I think, a very interesting case. So what we have then is a certain communality from the point of view of the Mediterranean states, an elite-driven effort to modernize. This is about social status. It's about economic position within society. It's also about political security, and growth becomes a key issue. In this context, it seems to me there's a logical link between the United States and the states of the Mediterranean. And that is that the United States ultimately, and actually from the beginning, looks like the best and possibly the unique interlocutor to develop these kinds of strategies of modernization. And I think it was very revealing yesterday. Is Professor Khalidi here right now or not? No, he's not. I purposely asked him what appeared to be a sort of a dumb question about, or maybe dumb comment about American officials at the time of a crisis like this, with the hope that he would in fact respond in the way he did, which was to say that having sketched out for us the reasons why Egypt is likely over the next couple of decades to find itself in a very close alliance with the United States. He then denounced the United States for 30 years of idiotic policy. Well, if the policy was so idiotic, why are the Egyptians signing up for another run at it? So the very nature of the American situation is that it really is increasingly across the Cold War the only game in town. The early period of the Cold War, I think you could argue that there were in fact two ideological systems in conflict, but as a number of speakers pointed out, the Soviet Union began to lose traction pretty early on in this process, and by the 1980s, certainly this later Cold War, the U.S. has no real strategic threat in the Mediterranean fields. Now, having said that, let me turn to the other side of this game. Well, let me do one other thing. Modernization, as I understand it, is also very appealing to American policymakers because it fits in very well with certain ideological predispositions. The central ones are, in fact, in the code of American exceptionalism. That is, the role of the United States is the lead society, the model society for human development, which is visible as early on as the foundation of the American Republic. What changes, I think, across 2 centuries is the way in which this role is carried out. That is to say, in the 19th century, because American power is relatively restricted, Americans tend to do their missionary work largely through non-governmental agencies, particularly American missionaries, but also Americans involved in trade and commerce in the Mediterranean region or any other region. In the 20th century, of course, the United States government has emerged as the main spear carrier both of the American view of international organization and to a certain extent also as the main spear carrier for a vision of modernization. So there's a fundamental power equation that's different here. Okay, so let's just pass on to some of the policy threads in the Mediterranean in the Cold War period. The first of them, obviously, is anti-communism, as my colleague pointed out. But let me stress, sort of turn this argument on its head and suggest to you that the basic struggle is not, in fact, between the United States and the Soviet Union per se, but as viewed from Washington, it's between the United States and national communist parties. I think that's a fundamental distinction. The threat that Washington perceives throughout this period is that the Communist Party of Italy or Portugal or wherever is going to take power and then make this portion of the Mediterranean a part of the Soviet sphere of influence. So it's first national communist parties, second the Soviet Union. And you see this a lot in the terminology that's used when referring to national communist parties as, in the Truman Doctrine, they're dangerous armed minorities. In a more broad sense, they're seen as cat's paws for the Soviet Union. But the idea in the Mediterranean, basically on a nation-by-nation basis, is to counteract these parties. I'd even go further. If you take a look at the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, which I would regard as kind of a poor man's Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower effectively takes the ideology of anti-communist national parties to an extreme. He's even opposed them in areas where they pretty clearly don't exist. And a lot of the American policy in the Middle East is the search for dangerous national communist parties, which in fact have largely been suppressed by the modernizing but authoritarian regimes of the area. Again, I think somebody mentioned this yesterday, but you see it particularly in 1958 when the Iraqi situation goes down, and Qasem suddenly, the Iraqi dictator, suddenly is seen as the perfect cat's paw for the entry of communism in the Soviet Union and so forth into Iraq. So it's certainly anti-communism is a key kind of a hook for understanding American policy. A second point I'd like to talk about, and probably divide it into two areas, is ideology. One of the questions that was asked yesterday repeatedly was the question of American attitudes toward decolonization. That's been brought up again today. I think, in terms of the writing of American foreign policy, have really missed the importance of ideology in this particular area. And I point to a book which I dearly love and frequently give to my students over at Georgetown by Michael Hunt called Ideology in American Foreign Policy. The amazing thing about this book, which was written during the Vietnam era, is it actually has nothing to do with ideology. The better title would have been Pathologies of American Foreign Policy Practice, in which Hunt does a wonderful job of showing exactly the areas in which American foreign policy has really deviated from its ideological roots. What he does not do, which I find astounding because of the volume of work that had been done even then, has been done subsequently, and of course we are in the age of the Tea Party, is talking about the founding fathers' view of foreign policy. And here you see, beginning in the 18th century, the establishment of ideas about the U.S. role as a model, and also the U.S. role as a natural leader of other societies and march toward the pursuit of happiness, if you want representative government, the pursuit of happiness and all of this. A better, I think, guide to understanding American foreign policy and ideology is probably Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, and it has, by the way, an interesting spin-off, which I highly recommend if you're thinking about American foreign policy. James Field's book about the U.S. and the Mediterranean in the 19th century, which does a wonderful job of integrating ideology with practice, and also deals to a great extent with these issues of decolonization. One of the things that strikes me is that the United States, from its origins, has been a national state with an extremely intense sense of its own sovereignty. And that's led us to draw a set of conclusions about international affairs, which are extremely important. One is that the United States, in terms of its entry into the international system and its management of its relationships in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, has had a tendency, basically, to accept the system as it exists. That is to say, when the United States got its going in the 19th, 18th century, it was basically accepting the notion that out there would be a whole set of potentially hostile European empires. At the same time, American policymakers have been consistently happier with the world based around national states. And as the decolonization process emerges, actually, let's go back a step. In the 19th century, as the process of the creation of independent units in Europe, I think particularly Italy and Germany, moves itself forward, American policymakers, and I'd argue most Americans are very comfortable with this kind of development. Similarly, on the area of decolonization, it seems to me the United States was reasonably comfortable with decolonization as long as it did not imply the arrival in power of a national communist party, at which point all bets are off. And I think you can see this process, as Andrew suggested, working its way out in the 20th century. I'd also stress, though, that this is one of the areas in which the United States owned, at least temporarily, and I have to turn to somebody else who's more knowledgeable about individual countries than I am. And that is, the United States has never been seen as necessarily opposed to the processes of decolonization within this structural framework. So it's a way in which American comfort level with decolonization fit in with the sort of the desires of various folks in the newly emerging areas of the world, that is to say, in what we used to call the third world. So, relative to ideological and also practical comfort zone with decolonization, which in turn reinforces, I think, the natural attraction between U.S. policymakers and U.S. policy in the individual states of the region, in this case the Mediterranean region. Let me go on and suggest something else. This is an issue that's come up again and again, and probably will come up again and again, and this is the issue of democratization. In an earlier version of myself, I used to refer to this as stabilization politics. And what I'm talking about is that a power that is essentially oriented towards status quo politics can see values in the process of democratization, but there are limits to the American commitment, at least in fact, as opposed to in rhetoric. In other words, the United States, in its public statements, since way back when, has always endorsed the concept of other people enjoying the same freedoms that Americans do. However, as a practical matter, American policymakers have regarded the process of democratization, I think you've seen it right now in Egypt, as something that arises from the internal structures of a society, and therefore is not something that the United States is willing to go out and stick its neck out on. In fact, I'm a great believer in the Humphrey Bogart theory of foreign policy, and some of you may remember at a certain point in this idealistic film Casablanca, Bogart turns to the leader of the European resistance, all dressed in white, and says to him, "I stick my neck out for nobody." This is, I think, a classic definition of the real practice in terms of democratization. Its value is as a tool of stabilization. Simply put, the theory and in general the practice has been that the United States gets on rather well with its fellow democracies. We don't spat with them, but we don't go to war with them. We don't have those kind of serious difficulties. Now, implicit in this also, looking at the sort of the front of the label as opposed to the caveats that are written on the back of the U.S. democratization level, is in fact the enormous gap between American rhetoric and American practice. And again, you can see this very much in events that are going on in Egypt right now. I just like to throw this out for consideration. Exactly what could the United States have done to forward the democratic aspirations of the Egyptian people in the last couple of weeks? Where can it go? What can it do going down the road in terms of doing this? And my suggestion would be that since force is obviously not on the table, and I would reckon it would be very, very difficult to get a corporal's guards from American citizens together to support the idea of a military intervention if things went wrong in Egypt, then you have to use the traditional tools of diplomacy, and that really constricts your ability to guide a governance process or a democratization process. Secondly, I'd like to just point out that there are cases in which the United States has felt itself forced to democratize other societies. And of course, the World War II example comes to mind in Germany, Japan, and our good friends, the Italians. And the American process there has been rather interesting. First of all, it has always been foreseen as a short-term process. In other words, we get in, we get out. I don't think anybody thought they'd get in and get out as fast as George W. Bush did, but, and of course stayed longer as a result. But essentially American planning has been based around the observation that what you wanted to do in cases of really virulent opponents, societies in which it seemed to American policymakers that the dangers of a recidivism of the same kind of practice were extremely strong. German Nazism, Italian fascism, Japanese, whatever you want to call it, activities in East Asia. You send in military force, you occupy the country, and then you begin the process of democratization, of establishing free trade or free enterprise, and most importantly, hopefully creating some kind of a basic alliance with the occupied country. This implies quick withdrawal, because the longer you stay, the more difficult it becomes, in fact, to project long-term influence in the society, and the more you become the object of public discontent. So it's not neo-colonialism, it's something quite much more sophisticated. In any case, I would also point out that in terms of the way in which Americans have carried out this policy, it goes right back to the ideological and legal roots of the country. That American occupation policy quite clearly is based on the Ordinance of 1787 that established the way in which the so-called Northwest Territories were created. And that this template is extremely important because it was used in every subsequent expansion of the American state. And therefore, the military officials would be familiar with it, and in fact applied it in 1898 in the Philippine Islands, and applied it everywhere else since then. So this is a wonderful example of how ideology, and particularly the ideology of democratization, is mixed up, in fact, with the way in which we carry out foreign policy. Let me turn then to a subject that came up yesterday, which I was totally unprepared for, but which strikes me as worth also mentioning. There's a lot of talk in this group, and I think wisely so, about the relationship between America and the British Empire in the Mediterranean. And with certain reservations, I'd like to endorse that notion that we were, in fact, the successor state to the British in the Eastern Mediterranean. But let me also point out a couple of things that seem to me to be getting out of kilter here. One, and I think the most fundamental one, was that we did not expect, as we entered into the Mediterranean during WW2, we did not really expect to replace the British in the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, burden sharing or partnership sharing was one of the principal constructs of American wartime policy. The second fact is that at least until November of 1943, the Brits were calling the shot, calling the tune, in terms of overall Allied strategy in the West. And it's quite evident that when Roosevelt reached Truman between June of 42 and the beginning of 43 at Casablanca, at every opportunity, the British imposed upon the Americans their strategic vision, which is one of going from south to north and reinforcing the basic British control of the Mediterranean through the military campaigns that would be undertaken. In November of 43, in a sort of a blinding moment, the United States flips the game on the Brits and begins to firmly dictate the strategy by which we will fight the Second World War. This is due to a couple of actual physical factors. The most important is the size of the American contribution to the war effort, both in terms of war production, but also in terms of manpower. At this point, the British are the secondary provider of manpower in the West. The U.S. is the primary. The U.S. has always been the primary producer of war materials. Second point I make is that no one, well, certainly people in the American administration were very aware of British economic weakness, and in some cases wanting to exploit this to bring up the imperial trade preferences. Nobody appears to have really contemplated or understood the degree to which Britain was going down the tubes economically, nor did the British. And as a result, as somebody pointed out yesterday, you get these funny moments in which the British appear to be off on an independent policy approach. And run into less to American opposition in many cases and more into the realities of their declining economic power. So there is a transfer of power, but it is not necessarily an American desire so much to replace the British as a kind of incremental step-by-step replacement of a state of power that's no longer able to carry its own weight in the Mediterranean. And there's a great deal of ambivalence on replacing the British as the go-to power, particularly in the Middle East. So, in any case, my conclusions then would sort of fit themselves into this. In understanding or trying to construct an idea of how American policy is carried out in the Mediterranean, I think that probably the historian who's understood it best is a British medievalist by the name of Chris Wickham. That basic to his strategy is, in fact, to accept the way in which Mediterranean is configured, that is to say, with a strong Arab-based component along the southern littoral and into the Middle East, with a unique set of problems involving the so-called northern tier, with a European Mediterranean angle too, and sort of begin by looking at these kind of sub-regional areas in which American policy operated on a comparative basis. Now, when I use the term comparative, I'm not talking about trying to create a one-size-fits-all kind of a relationship, but rather seeing what the United States did in relation to, say, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece, and also see where the differences lie. Because I think as much as anything, the differences are as telling as the parallels. That way, I think if you operate on this sub-regional context, put the European experience on sub-regional context into juxtaposition with the Middle Eastern policy, and also I'd say a separate North Africa policy, I think you'd be able to arrive at a much more coherent understanding of exactly what it is that the Americans were doing during this 40-year period. I do believe the differences are as important as the similarities. So my Mediterranean history might be described as yes, but. And I think I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Jim. I think in the questions we can come back to your concrete arguments about Greece, because I think empirically that's very interesting to display what you just talked about. Nicolas Sesma-Landrin is listed here as a commentator, but he's not a commentator. He's going to bring his own stuff to the table as an auxiliary or as an addition or as a paper in his own right. Nicolas is doing a postdoc at the European Institute here at Columbia, having earned his doctorate at the EUI on the topic of phalanges, the Institute of Political Studies. Is that a right translation? And he's the author of a monograph on José Larraz Lopez, who's, I guess, a mercantilist phalangist, or is it?
First finance minister of Franco.
Oh, is that right? Did he write about mercantilism, right? Did he write about mercantilism? What is it?
Mercantilism.
Or mercantilism? How do you pronounce it in the American? Yeah, from in the 1940s. Yeah, right. He sort of contested Heckscher. Yeah. He's also an editor of the Antología de la Revista de Estudios Políticos, and he will talk mainly about the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes, we're trying to kind of bring in the Western Mediterranean part to the link into the questions that were open in your paper. So the Western Mediterranean.
Speak up a little bit. Thank you.
The Western Mediterranean, basically Salazar's Portugal and Franco Spain, which can be considered as the rear guard of the Mediterranean within the Western security and defense system. So the starting point should be like know the position of these two regimes at the end of the Second World War. Basically, the starting point of the two regimes were different, mainly based on the origins of both regimes, but especially their attitudes during the Second World War, when Portugal, due to its traditional link with Britain, remained mostly neutral, and while Franco Spain tried to enter into the Nazis' new order, into the turning point of the war, until late 1942-43. And it didn't enter just because Hitler didn't want it to pay the price. First, after the end of the Second World War, together with the memories of the Spanish Civil War, still a very powerful memories in most of the political class of Europe at that time. The European democratic political culture pragmatism that was soon applied to other dictatorship unacceptable in the case of the relationship with the Franco regime. Both regimes, Salazar's Portugal and Franco Spain, were linked by a treaty called the Iberia Bloc that was signed in 1942 and renewed in 1948. So during the isolation period of Franco regime, Portugal acted as a bridge to enter in contact with the other Western countries through the Portuguese diplomacy. As a result of these two different situations, Portugal was more or less integrated into the new defense network since 1944, when they allowed the US to establish a Navy base in Lajes, in the Azores Island, in 1944. That Navy base was very important because it allows to control crucial routes versus the Atlantic. And so it was the Nazis, for example, were trying to convince the Portuguese and the Spanish to establish a Navy base or in the Canary Island or in the Azores. So got exactly coming from the other side. And in the same direction, Portugal became a member of NATO in 1949 and benefited from the Marshall Plan and entered into the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, and as a result signed a bilateral treaty of mutual defense assistance with the US in 1951. It was only excluded, and mostly by their own decisions, of the first efforts for the first attempt for the European Union project, as for example the Act Congress, but it was mainly because Salazar was still defending at that time the Euro-African doctrine, which is still important, still got a very powerful colonial empire, and this doctrine, which should be interesting to see how does it fit into the Mediterranean strategy in North and South. Consider Africa like the perfect economic and social complement of Southern Europe. On the contrary, position of Franco-Spain, Franco's state was condemned in the meeting of Potsdam, and the Allies initiated negotiations with the Republican government, which was in exile in Mexico, but at the same time they're establishing negotiations as well with the monarchies that were mainly based in Portugal, and trying also to go back to Spain. That was one of the main problems of the opposition of the regime, because it wasn't unified. It's still divided by the events of the Spanish Civil War. So we got the monarchies by one side, the Republican government in exile, and also we got the Communist Party, that in 1944, the Communist Party was mainly based on Moscow and Mexico as well, and very soon in southern France, and taking all the Republicans who fought with the French troops in the La Libération, it took them and tried to re-enter into the country and establish a network of maquis and guerrillas that started in 1944, but last till mid of the 50s. So again, they never kind of really shocked the regime that much, but still it was a Communist Party at that time, and as it was the Greek Civil War at the same time, and the opposition of the regime was so divided. At the same time, the problem of creating an instability again in the Iberian Peninsula, of having a new civil war, was one of the main concerns of the British, the French, and the US. Spain, of course, wasn't allowed to join the United Nations, and the United Nations condemned officially the regime in 1946 and recommend to recall all the ambassadors from the country, which in fact they did, apart from Switzerland and Argentina and maybe the Vatican probably, I don't remember now, but mainly Argentina was the main supporter of the regime at that moment with Perón, and they even established an agreement, Franco-Perón, in 1948. And then afterwards, Spain was also excluded of the Marshall Plan and from NATO. So from the American perspective, the decision of starting the negotiations will lead to the agreement of 1953 really fits perfectly with this logic of the Cold War we're talking about. It was mainly a US understanding of the situation. Because on the one hand, there was the rising communist parties in both Italy and France, especially in Italy, regarding the elections of 1948, the coup in Czechoslovakia, the risk of instability of the Iberian Peninsula, and that was a price that the Americans were not willing to pay, as it was no clear democratic alternative. And so when the containment doctrine was announced, and with the start of the Korean War, soon the Pentagon demanded the necessity of expanding the system of military bases worldwide with flexible agreements, and that basically the Mediterranean was to incorporate Greece and Turkey into NATO, but also to reinforce the existing facilities in Morocco, in Portugal, and in anti-communist Spain. What were those facilities important? They will provide a greater depth of the defense of the region in case of an attack coming from the Soviet Union, because the Pyrenees were considered like the natural barrier, like the first natural barrier in case of a Soviet attack, and also because especially southern Portugal and southern Spain were out of the range of the missiles from the Soviet Union, and that will have to place the B-47 nuclear bomber for the massive response that it was planning in case of an attack. So, for example, in Portugal, which according to this NATO strategy of providing rigor bases, that turns to the Beja military base in southern Portugal, which was one of the most important bases in southern Europe. On the other hand, there was not only military concerns, but also, like, in certain political circles in the US, like conservative Catholic circles, mostly circles that were created at the time of the Civil War, started to say that the policy toward Franco-Spain were mostly driven by the Soviet Union, and that it was always the Soviets' decision to tend to the policies of Spain. And as soon as the Wall Street Journal will say regarding the negotiations with Spain, the US should finish with this stupid idea that the United States can only be associated with countries politically pure. So in a way, apart from the own disunion and from their own responsibilities and failure, the Spanish democracy that was a victim of the appeasement policy during the Civil War period was again a victim of the Cold War. As a result, after several negotiations, especially between Franco and the Admiral Sherman in '51, the agreements, the so-called agreements of Madrid, were signed in '53. That included a military, mutual defense, and an economic aid and technical agreements. And they profit from. There were executive agreements. There were not treaties because acting like this, it wasn't needed a Senate's approval that could be put in risk on the agreement. And as a result, the US obtained 3 air bases, mostly in Seville, Madrid, and Zaragoza, and an air navy base in Rota, and other facilities including missile monitoring, radars in the Canary Islands. But also bringing Spain and Portugal into the system implied not only the Iberian Peninsula, because Portugal implies Angola as well, Guinea and Mozambique, and bringing Spain also brings into the picture the protectorate of Morocco, which was still Spanish at the time of the signing of the agreements, and Western Sahara. But this situation will change in 50s and 60s. Regarding to the persons that were in charge of the negotiations, for example, Myron Taylor, who was the special envoy of the US in the Vatican, Lincoln McBean, who was the American ambassador in Madrid in charge of the negotiation, but before had been ambassador in Lisbon, and also during the Greek Civil War, he was at that time in Athens. And George Train, for example, was the Marshall Plan administrator in Portugal, and then lead the negotiations with for the economic part of the Spanish agreement. I think we maybe can question ourselves about if there was any kind of special Mediterranean regime for dealing the negotiations with that specific type of countries. So that leave if there was only just one single policy rather than different single policies in terms of even forming different backgrounds for after that going into negotiations. And linked to a question that you opened on your paper about how important was the agreements of '53 to the survival of the regime. And the historiography is almost unanimous about that. It was really significantly important because the regime was really clearly isolated by '53, And in 1953 they signed two agreements, one with the Vatican, one other with the US, and that represents a lot of political support based on mainly on anti-communist ideology. And making also without any kind of liberation movements from the regime. There was no new laws or free elections or not even an attempt to look like. And it also allowed the regime to enter into the Western defense system. Also, it was from the back door with an executive agreement. But in any case, this turned into a stable friendship between Franco's dictatorship and US till the very end of the regime. One of the things that symbolize this importance very much is that Franco, for example, never went abroad, apart from in Dine to meet Hitler, Bordiga for meeting Mussolini, and one time he went to Lisbon to meet Salazar. And on the contrary, on the opposite side, it was again Salazar coming to Madrid. The other one was Trujillo, the Caribbean dictator, which is more well known because it was the topic of one of the novels of the recent Nobel Prize for Sesma-Landrin for his international ability. And the other ones were three American presidents. That was the only head of states that ever visited Franco. It was Eisenhower in 1959, Nixon in 1970, and Ford in 1975. So from that starting point, the situation will change along the 50s and the 60s. Concerning the Portuguese case, for example, it was very clear with the colonial wars. So the colonial wars started in Angola in 1969, in Guinea in 1963, in Mozambique in 1964, and caused an arms embargo from the Kennedy administration. So mainly because they were compromised with the colonization. And at the same time, the agreement of that military base, the Navy base in the Azores, were expired in 1962. So maybe at the same time. So the Portuguese that were really angry about this arms embargo denied the renewal of the Navy base, but the Americans were allowed to use it, and they used it in a stable terms until '69. So, but depending on the will of Salazar, that one day he will say that there's no more time to use the base. And on the contrary, when the Protectorate of Morocco gained their own independence in '56, Spain turned into defending colonialism into defending decolonization because of the case of Gibraltar. They tried to put Gibraltar into the framework of decolonization. So we can see again that a Cold War issue such as decolonization were used to try to fulfill a traditional national interest as it was Gibraltar. So it's very important if we try to understand the policies. At the same time, within the stability of the Maghreb region, the Spanish link with the member of the Arab League were very important in a sense with the US. There wasn't really like very powerful links, but at least in Egypt or in Lebanon, Spain was a respected country. They even sent delegations of the parties to study the system of the single party in Spain, and so there were kind of those kind of relationships. And so again, we can see if there were like different strategies to approach this kind of neo-nationalist state as Jean Touchard named them, and we can include on Portugal and Spain into the picture. So again, as the Spanish bases were getting more important because of this issue of the Portuguese, and we can see in every renewal negotiations in '63 and 1775, the Spanish administration was developing kind of a new foreign policy and imposing conditions harder and harder to American negotiators, as well as the relationships with the rest of the Western Europe were getting more in touch, and they even applied for entering into the Economic European Union in '62. To summarize, for modernization, for the economic development, also that the USA signed in '53 were very important. They received around 50% of what Italy received on the Marshall Plan, but anyway, it allows to prevent collapse, and the public loans given by the Import-Export Bank were really important also in terms of the positive impact within the whole economic regime's economy. And also because they linked with this military and economic agreements, there were some technical and educational programs who allowed the students to come to the US to study like new management programs, etc. Not only in economics but also in sociology, for example, is at that time when a young foreign student named Jose Lin, for example, came to the US to study sociology and then going back to Spain and do some research about entrepreneurs' behavior, etc., which is very important to the new stabilization in the 60s. And to more or less finish, all these issues are very, we can see it very symbolized in popular culture. For example, you probably all know about this Welcome Mr. Marshall, the thing that Victoria Graff also named in her book. That thing reflects very much like the aim of the population of really like improving their standards of living, but also one of the most popular, which I cannot resist to say, one of the most popular jokes at that time, links perfectly kind of the Cold War rhetoric and the economic help from the US, and Franco, who considered himself as a military genius after winning the Civil War. After the agreements of '53, started to call himself the first person who really defeated the Soviet Union in the battlefield. Not the Finnish or not Nazi Germany, but just me and the Spanish Civil War. So we got this military genius as chair in the Council of Ministers, and he asked his finance minister, so how's the situation like? I said, Excellency, we're completely broke. There's anything we can do about that. He says, I just see one solution, which is declare war on the US, expect them to defeat us, to invade us, and then to reconstruct us. And so Franco remained silent and said, I just see one problem. What if, thanks to me, we win? Things really very much covers the popular perception of American behavior, but also the nature, the same nature of Franco regime. And last but not least, these contradictions on the democratization side of because the Cold War was already won in Spain, because it was the most anti-communist country on earth. So, but the American propaganda could not be based on promoting democracy, because it wasn't a good point for the regime. So they kind of focused more or less on the standard of American lifestyle and the standard of living. But then when democracy came, the image of the United States were not linked to promoting democracy, but to sustaining a dictatorship. So the roots of the anti-Americanism that is in the Spanish political culture is mainly dominant even in the right wing, in the Catholic focus. The roots of that anti-Americanism comes from the Cold War period. And the best example is that the two biggest demonstrations that have been taking place in the whole democratic period in Spain haven't been against the Basque terrorist movement or in general strikes, but in two moments, in '86 when there was a referendum about joining the NATO and remaining with the military bases, and the other one was in 2003 against the intervention in Iraq.
Thank you, Nicolas. Okay, let's open it for conversation, dialogue, opposition, polemics, Bob.
The third polemic, okay. So I came here 2 years ago talking first about the myths of Van Damme, and I'd like to raise a question, Professor Miller, about the myths of the United States more generally. So I was wondering if you could tell us something. So you started out by sort of saying America has been about modernization for 300 years. It seems to me striking that a historian would be so anachronistic, using a term that emerges in the 1950s for some set of processes or some set of phenomena or institutions, et cetera, that exist much earlier. So one, I was wondering if you could tell us about something about the actual terms that are the thing that you think goes back 300 years, let's say when the professions began, when intellectuals and journals are being created to actually discuss the